to Talking Supply Chain. In each episode, top supply chain industry professionals and the nation's top thought leaders join host Brian Strait and share their unique insights to help supply chain managers stay one step ahead of their competition. This is Talking Supply Chain. There's a new sheriff in town, and with that comes change for supply chains. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Talking Supply Chain podcast. I'm your host, Brian Strait, and I want to thank you for taking a few minutes to join us for this episode. That new sheriff I'm speaking of is, of course, President Donald Trump. And at least early in his second term, tariffs are the word of the day. Trump has threatened tariffs on his favorite adversary, China, but he's also suggested tariffs on other countries, including Mexico and Canada. Joining me today to help decipher all this tariff talk is Peter Anderson, Global Supply Chain Lead at Genpact. Peter, welcome to the podcast. Glad to have you.
Thanks for that, Brian. Really looking forward to the discussion on this very pertinent topic at the moment.
Yeah, and just to our audience out there, the goal here is to provide factual information on tariffs and what businesses need to know and kind of where the market is and where we are. So this is not necessarily a political discussion, although tariffs obviously are a political topic. But we're going to try to do our best to provide factual information for you that can help you in your business. So before we get into that, though, and we're going to talk a little bit about the implications they have and some things of what companies can do and now and in the future to address this. But before we even get into that, Peter, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about Genpact and what you guys do.
No, I appreciate it, Brian, and thanks for inviting me on today. So Genpact. Genpact's an advanced technology services and solutions company. We truly help global business elevate supply chain performance, combining industry expertise, advanced digital technologies, AI, data, and proven methodologies to gain critical end-to-end supply chain visibility. That's really critical when we're thinking about this topic today around tariffs. I've got over 20 years of supply chain managed services and consulting experience, and Genpact has been around for 25 years. So it's amazing how much they do for the world's largest companies, designing, transforming, and running their supply chains. My own personal background, I've been with Genpact now for a period of time. I was in industry as a chief supply chain officer for 8 years. And prior to that, I spent 20 years in consulting, working with many of the large Big Four consulting firms, helping people shape and design their supply chains.
So seeing it from both sides of the equation here, which I think would bring a really interesting perspective to this conversation for us today. I think all of us know the dependence the U.S. has on China, right? That's well known, and I think many in the industry probably know how dependent we've become on Mexico. But I think for the broader audience, and people may not be completely aware because maybe their business is a little more isolated or whatnot. Can you kind of get this conversation started by talking about how Mexico itself kind of fits into the U.S. supply chain today, especially in terms of the manufacturing and the trade between the countries these days?
It's a great question, Brian. And I mean, the interesting thing is, and not a lot of people realize this, is Mexico is our largest trade partner from an import and export perspective. I think the last numbers that came out, we were nearly an 800 billion position with Mexico. We're actually, it's ahead of obviously China now, and it's ahead of Canada as well. So Mexico is absolutely critical to how our supply chains work. A lot of that was also driven because of the last round of tariffs back in 2017, 2018, when people started to try and mitigate that. And we can talk about that a little bit further on. But also the move from NAFTA to USMCA actually drove a lot of trade into Mexico because of different requirements that were required for USMCA. So with the ability to have to move things back from what I would call the traditional low-cost countries, Mexico was the next alternative, and actually has been a great supply chain hub now for a number of years. Great capabilities, great companies there that produce things. So it's a critical part, a truly critical part of the US supply chain network. I don't even think of Mexico as being separate to the US. Personally, when I was in the industry.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the USMCA. I don't hear many people actually speaking about that these days in regards to the tariffs and the importance that that deal played in the nearshoring trend that we've seen in the last few years, the acceleration of it. I mean, it did exist before that, but the acceleration of it. So it's nice that you mentioned that because I think it gets dropped out of the conversation a lot, and it's a really important part of this whole trade between Mexico and the U.S.
Well,
So
it's really interesting. People think of the trade and people moving to Mexico because of the implications of China, but USMCA drove in many industries new content requirements, and those content requirements meant that we had to produce either in Canada, the US, or Mexico,
yeah,
which meant that where we'd done a lot of things in the past, maybe in Latin America or other parts of the world, it actually drove us to bring things to Mexico. So it really was a double-headed piece between USMCA and the China tariffs.
yeah. So as we're sitting here recording this today, and I mention that because by the time this gets published, I don't know what the situation will be. It may change the way things seem to be changing quickly these days. But as we're recording it today, the U.S. and Mexico had reached an agreement to postpone Trump's proposed 25% tariffs, at least as I understand, till the beginning of March, right? Pending further discussions that the two countries are going to have, and the same with tariffs with Canada. We did put in place a 10% tariff on China as of February 1st. So I, I guess as we kind of get into this conversation, I wanted to get your thoughts on the tariffs in general and how significant these tariffs are on Mexico if they were to be implemented. And because I think that's still on the table at this point right now. And how that changes, how that relates to a 10% tariff on China. Is there maybe a larger economic impact from a tariff, from a 25% tariff on Mexico as opposed to 10% on China, even though we get so many goods from China?
I, I think we will see the impact economically much faster than we ever did from the China side.
Yeah.
And there was I mean, the rationale behind that is obviously there were much longer supply chain lines in terms of shipping from China to the US. So there tends to be a lot more inventory in the pipe dealing with China. So those tariffs, if they were to be applied, would take longer to come through. Whereas Mexico, we have shortened supply chain lines, we've
Hmm.
reduced inventories dramatically. So it's running much more. Instead of being in weeks of inventory held, we're into either days or a very limited number of weeks. So the move on Mexico will have a much faster effect, a much faster economic effect than we saw when we actually had the big tariffs put on China back in the 2017, 2018. It's the intimacy that we have with Mexico also means that we do things a lot faster than we ever developed with the China market as well. So it will have a detrimental effect on innovation and speed to market.
Yeah. And look, I mean, the tariffs are not in effect at the moment for Mexico or Canada. So we're there. But I don't know. I mean, the way the environment seems to be, of it, that we can't rule out the fact that tariffs may not come into effect in Mexico. So I think it's something that's important to talk about, and understand for businesses as to what to do. And that's part of what I hope we'll get to in a little bit. There is what to do and how do you prepare for that. So
I know. I think that again, it's a brilliant question. I think the challenge this time is we had options and alternatives
yeah,
when it was more of a single country push in terms of the China tariffs previously. This time, although I mean we've talked about Canada, we've talked about Mexico and China. There's also the potential out there for EU or UK or other places as well.
yeah,
So it's not just a we need to move out of China now. It's what impact does it have truly from a global perspective?
yeah. Yeah. And I mean, you mentioned the tariffs on China. I mean, so dealing with tariffs is not new. I mean, we've done this. I mean, this predates Trump. It predates Trump the first term, right? I mean, we had tariffs prior to Trump. They, typically were in targeted areas and targeted products or businesses or industries. Um, but I think what Trump is proposing this time is tariffs on a much broader scale, right? I mean, you mentioned EU possibly, I mean, other countries, we saw potentially, was it Colombia, I think, right? At one point threatened them with tariffs. And Biden, even when his term, I mean, the tariffs that Trump had put in the first time on Canada and China, Biden didn't pull those back, right? I think most of them remained in place. So this has been something that businesses have been dealing with. So since you went through this in Trump presidency, with tariffs in your previous job. Can you kind of look back on that and share some of your experiences and how you guys worked with companies and try to navigate around some of that initial tariffs, which were much more targeted? than what the what's being proposed now, of course. But
No, and I mean, I think it was the first time we'd had to do analysis at scale in such a short period of time.
yeah,
And we'll maybe talk about that a little bit in a moment. But I mean, it really was very difficult getting all of the true costs, all of the implications, and what alternatives you actually really had. I mean, I started out by saying and looking at saying, well, let's take the traditional approaches. What can we do from a dual or a parallel sourcing? What can we move from country to other places? Um, One that proved remarkably effective was actually going and sitting and talking with suppliers and saying, are you prepared to bear some of these costs? Interestingly, I mean, in some instances, I got some suppliers to bear all of the costs from China. In other instances, we agreed on a certain split for a certain period of time.
yeah,
So suppliers were really understanding because they didn't want to lose the business and actually create problems for themselves as well.
yeah,
Um, we looked at working with others in different geographies and seeing whether we could think about leveraging spend in a different way, where maybe we hadn't worked with somebody in the past. We said, well, maybe we can go and work with one of our big suppliers and see whether we can get, for instance, like sort of metal castings in a different way and leverage the spend of the two companies to get a better position. And then the one which was, it comes back to, I guess, the Mexico challenge piece is that we actually worked with many suppliers who were already looking to move to different parts of the world and like sort of get to a point where it was creating less risky supply chains for them. And I mean, many Chinese companies who were suppliers to organizations worked with their customers and set up their own facilities in Mexico. So, I mean, effectively all we did in some instances was move the Chinese supplier to be located in a different region, and that worked very well as well. And so,
yeah.
I mean, it really is taking all of these different strategies together and thinking about what can and what you can't do. Um,
No, I was going to say, I mean, you moved in your previous job, you moved about $380 million worth of tariff related products, right? I mean, there was a lot of money that you had to deal with, and you mentioned some of the strategies you did. Were there any that were particularly advantageous or particularly effective that you did?
um, I think I was saying the hardest bit was actually figuring out what we could and what we couldn't do.
Yeah,
There's an awful lot of things that you can't move. Be that for it being a sole supplier, or maybe it's a very specific piece of IP that only one company in the world can actually provide for you.
mm,
So, in some instances, you actually don't have a choice of moving it. And in some industries, you certainly don't have a choice in the short term because it may mean that you have to go through regulatory authorities, you have to get different standards of testing, a whole host of things that actually make it prohibitive to change just from the costs of doing that, regardless of like sort of, I mean, it would make sense just to keep paying the tariff because
yeah,
you can't physically move it. Um, but the concept of actually working with the suppliers and the tariff sharing was one that really made a big difference for us very quickly, because we had a number of conversations with suppliers face to face and explained the situation and what it was going to do both to their business and our business going forward. And because we had lots of great relationships with long-term suppliers, I mean, they were true business partners in many instances. It was a much easier discussion to talk about tariff sharing and coming up with workarounds than it would have been if it was a true customer supplier, just transactional relationship.
yeah,
Um, the interesting part in all of it is that when we actually started getting into the true details, we figured out that a lot of those nearshoring or offshoring advantages that have been like sort of the reason why we'd moved to places in the first instance actually have been mitigated because obviously the price of goods coming from China had been increasing as well over
mhm,
a period of time. So we then started looking at nearshore, Mexico, Brazil, other places, and we weren't finding that much of a price differential between them. So that was a really successful piece and actually mitigating risk in our supply chain, but at the same time, actually getting out of the tariffs and getting back to a similar cost base as well. So in some ways, what happened in 2017, 2018 for many companies woke up what were very long, difficult supply chains to manage, and actually brought us to the ground with a bump. But at the same time, it actually made us start to think very differently about how we should be designing and creating supply chains of the future.
Yeah. And then we had COVID. And right. But you know, you've mentioned this twice now in the conversation, and I just want to follow up with this in that I think all the different things you said there, to me, the one thing that resonates most with me in what you just said was the communication component of this, right? I mean, talking to your suppliers instead of just simply making a decision.
No, absolutely. And I mean, I think companies that are super successful and have those relationships with suppliers where you can go and talk about the most difficult topics, and you do that on a regular basis. So you don't just talk when there's a problem, there's actually ongoing communication. I think back to my days in industry before coming back to consulting. Um, some of the meetings I'd love to take part in more than anything else was those real discussions with suppliers about what are you doing differently in your supply chain? What innovation are we bringing? What innovation are you bringing?
Mm.
What challenges are we going to face together? And actually having those conversations with your suppliers on an ongoing basis makes it much easier when you actually get to one of these cliff events.
Yeah. And I think as we talk about suppliers, I mean, suppliers are such an important part of this, obviously, because they make the businesses go, right? But I think there's a significant challenge for many of them, and that is, how do they accurately predict and forecast the impact that a microeconomic event such as a tariff may have on their business? And I think that impacts everything from like their cost management process to navigating blockages and in the supply chain, or customs. I mean, there's a whole host of things, right? When products move. So you're putting on your consulting hat for a minute here. What suggestions would you have for suppliers, especially when it comes to tariff and tariff mitigation, to help them gain better visibility into their global supply chains and create a better or more robust planning and forecasting platform?
I mean, I think the big thing is to utilize technology. I mean, even today, we have technology that's available that is a million times better than we had back in 2017. I remember in 2017 going through this whole exercise of trying to figure out which suppliers were going to have an impact on me. And then you start realizing that it's not just your tier one suppliers, it's how do you dig down to tier two, tier three, tier N? And the ability to manage all of that and to figure that out. And I mean, I was talking to a CPO just recently, and we were chatting about they had about 5,000 suppliers, and I said to him, "So how many suppliers do you manage strategically?" He said, "Well, we only actually have the ability to manage about 200." Um, and so, if you think today about the tools that are available with agentic AI, not Gen AI, because Gen AI is very much about just taking data that's available and repurposing it into something that is really useful. You're using agentic AI, which is much more looking at what's potentially going to happen, very predictive, operating in an autonomous way,
Mhm.
also being able to contextualize things. That's really key in all of this, the contextualization. If an agentic agent can actually go and work through all of that, they can come back with solutions and predict some of the capabilities that we need to have that we were never able to do in the past. And so I smile a little bit these days because in the next few years, we'll have all of this figured out because people will be able to play those tunes with scenarios and look at things that we were never able to model, not even 5 years ago. So technology is going to help everybody in this. But
Yeah.
technology is also going to make it much more open because people are going to be able to see what's going wrong much faster. So it's this dual-edged sword, unfortunately.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's probably a lot of business out there that need to know what's going wrong faster, right? So,
Possibly.
yeah. I want to ask a question about the impact of tariffs, right? And we all know that one of the goals of Trump and his use of tariffs is to bring manufacturing back to the US. There are some products, shoes and clothing, for instance. I don't know that US manufacturing can ever be competitive from a price standpoint to make the products here. Maybe there is a viable path there, but because just labor intensive products just may not be the best fit for US manufacturing. But there are certainly a lot of other products, a lot of other materials that can be manufactured here in the United States. And that brings us to, I think, a bigger question about the employment market in this country. And we all know that labor shortages are an issue for most industries. Manufacturing capacity is not what it was years ago, and we just don't have as many manufacturing facilities around there. So, if the goal is to bring manufacturing back to the US and we're successful at that, do you think in your mind do we have the capacity here to meet an increased demand in manufacturing? And if we don't now, what do we need to do as a country to build out that infrastructure so that we can be successful in reshoring and onshoring?
Oh, this is one of my pet subjects. Uh, I started out actually as a manufacturing apprentice, and so I didn't go to school straight from, or didn't go to college straight from school. I actually did a manufacturing apprenticeship program, and so I think there's a whole piece around training and reskilling and capability development that we need to think of independently of that. But I think overall the answer is again we're at an inflection point. Um, Technology out there in terms of how we think about factories and what we do with them is very different to what it was a few years ago. Um, with everything with cobots and lights out factories and things, they are a reality. And so we do have the ability to bring some things back and do some things very differently. Um, Actually, we can't bring it back without doing that because you hit the nail on the head. We actually don't have enough skills within the US to do that at this point in time. And that's why I say I think we have to think much more about training, reskilling, and
Yeah.
other types of programs. But there's one bit that we miss in all of this. And if you think about all the things that we potentially could bring back, and then think about all of the movements, the additional movements that would create on our infrastructure, be that on the roads or be it on rail. So if something gets made today, um, let's use China as an example, you get a finished product coming in, it comes in a container, it gets shipped to a DC, gets sorted out. Well, if we start manufacturing those things in the US, we have significantly more freight movements on the road unless we start adopting technology and doing things in a very different way than we do today. And the challenge is we have the labor issue, but I think we have as equally a bigger problem from an infrastructure and an asset structure in the US. If you think about just the rail network we have, I mean, it would be wonderful to put much more on rail for sustainability reasons and a whole host of other things, but we actually just don't have the capacity to do that today. And so I think we have to answer all of these pieces together if we truly are going to make the US the manufacturing powerhouse that it once was.
So it's not just answering the manufacturing capacity question. It's not just answering the labor availability question. It's answering the logistics
The
component piece as
logistics,
well.
the whole support network
Yeah.
around it. You just think about like sort of the how much we have as like sort of terminals on the outside of the US that take in millions and millions of containers versus what we have in terms of how you can move things on a rail network or on the road network in the US. And maybe we solve some of that with technology. I mean, if you think about things like platooning potentially for logistics, gets around some of those things. But it means we would also have to change the infrastructure and how roads are set up and how there are on and off ramps for logistics vehicles for platooning. So it's, I think it's all doable, Brian. I mean, I think this is a vision for the future that is a great place to head towards. But I think we need a much broader policy around it as to connecting the two together and making sure that we don't trip ourselves up in the process.
Yeah, in other words, solving what we're going to solve one issue, bring manufacturing back, and then we're just going to bottleneck ourselves because we don't have the other parts of the equation answered. Um, seems like a perfect place for my flying plane that can just carry containers and pick them up and drop them in various places, right? So-
But somebody once said to me, Brian, we're solving the wrong problem, trying to get to autonomous level 5 for self-driving cars. They smiled and said it would actually be much easier to make the cars fly like they did in the Jetsons many years ago. And if you think about it like that, you think maybe we are trying to solve the wrong problem sometimes.
I've always wondered. I'm not an engineer. I don't know whether you could do this or not, but I've always wondered. As we create autonomous planes, so can we just not create an autonomous plane that can carry two containers at a time, or three
I,
containers at a time?
I'm not an expert in this, but I'm sure there's somebody out there that would opine on that.
Yeah. So anyway, I want to talk a couple of financial considerations here regarding tariffs. So one of them is the long-term impacts on a company on the investment and its manufacturing decisions if there's tariffs, especially as tariffs may come and go, right? And Mexico, Canada, I think is a great example here where we almost had tariffs and we may have tariffs. What kind of impact does this kind of environment leave for the business in terms of their decisions as far as what to invest in, where to make manufacturing decisions, where to move supply chains?
Again, it's huge question, much broader than we even have time to answer today. I mean, you got to look at it from a perspective about where are you actually at with your current manufacturing capacity. You've just invested in a whole host of new factories. Actually, writing them all off and then trying to set up some new ones is probably not an opportunity anyway. I mean,
Right.
when we look at like sort of the life cycle of a factory, I mean, it could be anything from 10 to 50 years. I mean, in fact, in my old role, I had average age of factories of 58 years, a number of them over 100. And because of the cost of replacement and the infrastructure that's associated with them. I mean, if you think a factory can cost you anything from a couple of 100 million to many billions, it's a much bigger question than just the tariffs piece at this point. And actually making the decision on a factory that cost you a couple of billion, the bigger question is more about the consistency of the policies that are out there. So it actually allows you to make those investments and feel confident that you're actually in a place where that's the right investment in the right location for an appropriate period of time, because you actually don't have the choice or the ability to change. And I think that's some of the challenges that we face at the moment around this. That if you're in certain industries, you really don't have much choice in some of these things.
So I want to skip ahead to a question I was going to ask you a bit later, but I think it's relevant now. And that is, regarding these things, the capital investment decision that a company has to make when it's investing it's deciding where to invest its capital. I've seen various things on this. In some cases, like the idea is that, hey, we put a tariff in place and jobs are going to move, right, and they're going to come back here. Others say, maybe don't overreact to that, right? Um, is what role does a tariff should play? What role should a tariff play? Is the way I ask it in a capital investment decision that a company has to make. Because they, like I said, they can be short term or they can be long term situations. So how do you consider when you're looking at a capital investment the role of a tariff and what consideration should you give it?
So I think that there's a whole host of work that you actually have to go through in this and do that modeling and make the decisions based on things that you know are fixed, but
Mhm.
do all of the particular sensitivity analysis around what would happen. Would that location, would that site, would that investment still be appropriate if tariffs did change by 25%? So instead of looking at it in the moment and saying, this is the facts today, going through probably an even more rigorous process than people think about and doing that scenario analysis to say, do you know what? If tariffs came down by 5%, did it mean we would have made a different decision? If tariffs went up by 50%, would it have made a different decision? And then started doing Monte Carlos and other things around that to say, what's the likelihood of some of these things potentially happening? And that comes back to, I mean, looking at the US and obviously policies and the potential for change over a period of time. So, I mean, there's a whole host of work that, as supply chain professionals, in the past 10, 15 years ago, we would have just looked at it and said, oh, yeah, it's in the best place because it's got the least amount of miles, it's got a good labor force, I've got my suppliers closely located. But now, when you're looking at these investment decisions, it's significantly greater. I mean, we started obviously many years ago bringing in what is a particular state or a particular country going to give you as investment for building in that location. We really now need to expand it out and use much longer term data and even data that as supply chain professionals we probably didn't consider around financial markets and other areas. I mean, it's much more fun being a supply chain person, but at the same time, our role has suddenly got infinitely more complex.
Yeah. Yeah. Want to ask you one question, just given your history in the industry and experiences on both sides, consulting and in actually in the market, dealing with these things. But are there particular companies or segments that are more vulnerable to tariffs than others? I think auto is probably an obvious case with the amount of goods that cross borders between Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. Some of them multiple times. But are there any other verticals or any other industries that maybe should be really concerned about tariffs, even if they're not in place right now?
I think there are many industrial companies, manufacturing companies that have taken advantage of the upskilling of the labor force in places like Mexico. And so they have supply chains now that have evolved and developed much more into Mexico than they had in the past.
Yeah.
So I think that side of it. Obviously, we're seeing more CPG products coming in from Mexico as well because of the population that we actually have in the US and population distribution. So I think there's more than people realize. And that's why we're in the situation where we nearly have 800 billion of trade
Yeah.
with Mexico.
Want to wrap up with two kind of forward-thinking questions or thoughts. Get your thoughts on these things. First, what advice would you offer to suppliers that may be scrambling right now as they try to deal with potential tariffs? And the second part of that is, what is your expectation for the next few years in terms of the manufacturing breakdown between the United States and abroad? Do you think we'll see that mix change significantly?
So let me try the first question. I think you need to actually start to look at the data and look at the true implications and start to assess what those options are and do that sensitive analysis in the Monte Carlo I talked about.
Mhm.
Um, I remember working with a client a few years ago where we looked at all of the manufacturing sites and said, do you know what? Technology has actually moved on so much that if we build new sites, new factories, they're 2.5 times more efficient than what they have as a footprint already. And more importantly, that's when capital was at a cost of almost zero. So those sorts of things actually, I think, drive how you think about this. When capital is more expensive, it's more difficult to actually do some of these things and have the flexibility to do it. But truly assess at the deepest level what you can and can't do and understand what that future might look like and then put some scenarios around it.
Yep.
Talking about the reshoring piece, I'm in the camp of that it's no longer really whether it happens or not, it's when it happens. I think reshoring and manufacturing is coming back to the US. It's inevitable. I think for a whole host of reasons, from a policy perspective, but also the ability from a technology advancement perspective. Technology is making it possible to do that. However, we have to figure out how to get the right skill sets, how to attract them, how to develop them, and more importantly, how to retain them in the US. And so when we fix those two components of it, I think we have the ability to become that manufacturing powerhouse again.
Yep. You can't have one without the other,
Absolutely
basically.
can't.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter. We are out of time. If anyone would like to get in touch with Genpact, kind of discuss your services and what you guys offer, is there a really good way for them to reach out to you guys?
Um, if you go onto the Genpact website, you'll be able to get onto the supply chain team there and contact them. And obviously, I can be contacted directly through LinkedIn at any point, Brian. So
Okay,
I
great.
would love to share these thoughts with other people. But thanks so much for allowing me the time today to have this conversation with you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Peter. We are out of time. Um, Tariffs, look, the tariffs and threats of tariffs are not going away anytime soon. So, as supply chain leaders, it's time that you kind of brush up on what you need to do, and that process needs to start now. In deciding how to manage your businesses going forward. So, I want to thank my guest today, Peter Anderson, global supply chain lead at Genpact, and all of you who took time to listen today. I greatly appreciate it. You spending a few minutes with us. A new episode of Talking Supply Chain comes out each Thursday. You can find it on scmr.com or wherever you get your podcasts. So be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. We'd like to like to join with you. Until next time, this is Brian Strait, and you've been listening to Talking Supply Chain. Talking Supply Chain is produced by Supply Chain Management Review and Peerless Media. You can find it on scmr.com, supplychain247.com, iTunes, Google Podcasts, or wherever you find your podcasts. For more information on this topic or to sign up for our weekly newsletter, a print or a digital subscription to our publication, visit scmr.com. We hope you will join us for our next episode. For Supply Chain Management Review, I'm Brian Strait, and thank you for listening.